All right, well, thank you so much for coming to the Cato Institute. We're so happy you came to this excellent book discussion. We have the author of Let Colleges Fail here, and we will get to pester him with all sorts of questions. Before we do that, it is pretty traditional to introduce the speaker. And you typically run through their professional accomplishments. And, you know, Rich is in his 60th year of teaching. The last I heard, you were being paid $1 by your university?
Yes, paid me $1, and because they paid me $0, there was problem with something with, I don't know, some governmental regulation, some nonsense.
So he's been teaching for a long time, but still hasn't learned how to negotiate, is the moral of the story there. But more importantly, he's been a scholar of higher education for the past few decades, and he has put out many, many books. All of them are kind of must-reads for people who are concerned about the state of higher education and curious about ways to improve it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Rich, who will give us a quick overview of the book.
Okay. Do you want me to?
Yeah, go use the podium.
The sermon, it worked for Abraham. I think did Abraham Lincoln have a mic? No, he didn't, did he? But I will. Excuse me, folks, while I walk over here. I'm delighted to be here. I have had an association with, I want to thank Andrew for inviting me. Long remarks tend to be boring, so as King Henry VIII told his fifth wife, I will be brief. I've had a long association with Cato. I've written several times for the Cato Journal, dating back 40 years. Cato even nicely dedicated an issue to me in 2016. One of my best friends, Neil McCluskey, decided not to come today, but otherwise he likes me. I think he had some health issue or something. He wrote a spectacular book called Unprofitable Schooling. Andrew did his undergraduate work with me at Ohio University, and after getting his PhD, worked at my Center for College Affordability and Productivity. I even attended his wedding. So, America's faith in universities has undergone a sharp decline. Demonstrated recently, of course, by the war between the Trump administration and especially elite private universities, and even at the state level, as public officials used to give generous subsidies are now increasingly restricting university operations. For example, often outlawing the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices that are costly, maliciously anti-merit, and typically racist. This enhances the notion that maybe merit alone, not skin color or sexual orientation, should be the basis for academic advancement. So in the first chapter of my newest book, Let Colleges Fail, The Power of Creative Destruction in Higher Ed, I list 10 problems with American universities. First, enrollment decline has occurred for the first prolonged period in American history. Second, I'm using my fingers, I call this West Virginia PowerPoint. Second, creatively important public support and confidence in universities is very low, imperiling a sector that cannot financially exist solely from tuition fees, research grants, or endowments. Third, unpopular ideas are too often suppressed or ignored. A vibrant university is filled with civil but vigorous debate, airing alternative perspectives on contemporary issues. And related to that is a fourth problem. Intellectual diversity has been declining on campuses. Too often, far left or progressive perspectives dominate the faculty who instruct the students and advance the research agenda. I once met an Ivy League Republican sociology professor and I was so startled that I asked him for his autograph. One survey shows that there are no Republican professors in Yale's very large history department. Fifth, the cost of college is high, both for the customers and the broader public. Per student spending in the U.S. is far higher than in comparable democracies like Canada, Great Britain, or Japan. Six, some reliable evidence suggests that typically students do not learn terribly much over 4 or 5 years in college. Recent college graduates often are embarrassingly similar to new high school grads in their general knowledge, their vital critical reasoning skills, or sometimes even in the specialized training needing to excel vocationally. They're shockingly ignorant of glorious historical and civic accomplishments dating back to ancient times. Seventh, colleges are overwhelmed by administrative bloat, persons ostensibly supporting mainline academic activities, but instead often crowding out emphasis on job one, the creation and dissemination of truth and beauty. Eighth, even as our competitive market-based free enterprise system propels Americans to new levels of affluence, graduation with a college education has seemingly stagnated for low-income Americans, stifling higher education's role in facilitating the American dream. This mainly reflects public policy errors such as botched public assistance programs, more than collegiate misdeeds, but still it's inconsistent with offering college for all. Ninth, in a narrow financial sense, the typical rate of return on investment in higher education has probably declined somewhat in modern times. Minimally, it's true that college today is often a rather risky financial commitment. For example, over 1/3 of entering freshmen have not earned a bachelor's degree after 6 years. Another 1/3 or more of recent graduates are, for a period, what the New York Federal Reserve Bank calls underemployed, working low-paid, unskilled jobs, usually held by those with only with a high school education. 10th, colleges are simply awful at efficiently using their human and physical resources. Buildings lie empty many months a year. Faculty write papers for some journal of last resort that few read or cite, and kids typically take 4 or even 5 years to finish a degree that superb universities like Oxford and Cambridge say should be completed in under 3 years. And this list is not exhaustive. Some speak about the millions that schools spend annually on ball throwing contests that have nothing to do with learning. Others stress more specific concerns. For example, why does it take 7 years after high school, after 7 years of schooling after high school, to practice law in America? Well, you can do it in about 4 years in England. Why? While many would perhaps justly say that America has the planet's best universities, America's economic exceptionalism largely reflects the extraordinary success of competitive free enterprise capitalism. We've gone from a few 100,000 people, poor settlers in 1700, to becoming the world's leading economic power and richest large nation in the world today. Yet this great success has also been accompanied by a lot of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. I compared the top 25 universities in the U.S., according to U.S. News, in the year 2000, and then again 22 years later, in 2022. Almost no change. NYU replaced the University of Virginia at 25. Virginia went to 26, huge drop. Zero destruction. Contrast that to the top 25 companies on the Fortune 500 leading corporation list. Over 3/4 of the companies were importantly different in 2022 compared with 2000. Creative destruction at work for corporations, but never for universities. In 2000, Sears and Roebuck, Enron, and Compaq Computer were in the top 500, even in the much higher than that. Where are they today? Harvard was in the top 5 universities in 2022, in 2000, in 1900, in 1800, and in 1700. Now, mistakes in private business often are fatal, forcing companies to make big changes in order to survive. Yet success in private business is worth millions, sometimes billions, to top executives. Rewards for success and punishment for failure are huge. By contrast, at the top university, the president might get a $100,000 bonus for success. But even measuring success is difficult, but breathtakingly easy in private business. Just look at earnings reports and stock prices. Did Georgetown University or Iowa State have a good year in 2024? How would you know? Perhaps colleges could learn something from our highly successful business sector. Maybe the already growing number of college closings will scare colleges into changing in ways making them more responsive to public needs, doing more with less. Let me suggest 9 areas for reform discussed in my book that would reduce some of these problems talked about. First, take a lesson from K through 12 education and introduce more consumer sovereignty. State governments give many dollars to educational producers, called state universities, instead of to the consumers, the students, in the form of scholarships. Why not give the state subsidy money directly to the kids, forcing the universities to compete harder? So-called state universities would then be largely sort of semi-privatized, gaining freedom to decide their own rules for institutional government or curriculum. Second, take another lesson from European universities. 3 years of study for a bachelor's degree. Thomas Edison would be another good example, but Thomas Jefferson took only 2 years to get his degree at William and Mary at age 20, and later wrote the Declaration of Independence and certainly demonstrated he was an educated man. Less brilliant students than Jefferson should be able to do it in 3 years. Third, introduce markets within universities to more rationally allocate resources. Give each budgetary unit some cash, but then make it rent offices, classrooms, and laboratories. Maybe even give the faculty members a budget from which they rent their own office and parking spaces from the school. If 3 departments want to use a popular lecture hall at 10 a.m. on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, auction off the space. Fourth, colleges and universities spend much time and resources on things that have absolutely nothing to do with what should be their only job: disseminating and creating knowledge and artistic expression. Why do they serve food and rent out rooms? In many schools, students are forced to live for 1 or 2 years in dorms. You were one of these. He went to my university. And eat food provided by a monopolistic provider, and then rejoice after that when they can rent out rooms and get food from fiercely competitive private entrepreneurs at lower prices and better quality. Fifth, creative destruction is increasingly coming to higher education. This helps create opportunities for new institutions that don't have to fight entrenched interests, that think that they own or control the school. 6, in accreditation as it now exists, I could write a book on all the problems accrediting agencies cause. They restrict competition. They often evaluate schools based on inputs used rather than outcomes achieved. Sometimes they try to enforce ideological positions that are often offensive and anti-merit based. They're controlled by existing universities or by groups like the American Bar Association, usually opposing freewheeling competition and unsettling new ideas like shorter paths to degree completion. Accreditation is supposed to provide information about school quality, but really it's usually a binary system like pregnancy. You either are or you're not, with no quality distinctions. Harvard University has the same accreditation as nearby Bridgewater State University. Are they the same? No. Trump would believe that Bridgewater is the better of the two schools now, but anyway, maybe. 7th, we examine kids constantly in school, including colleges. We administer college entrance examinations. Nearly every course has more exams. Why don't we, shortly before college graduation, have all students take a National College Equivalence Exam, or NCEE, a several-hour-long exam measuring general knowledge as well as that in a specialty, the student's major. Then we could say the average senior at Hillsdale College got an 81 on the NCE, but at Harvard it was only 79. The test results would say more about student learning than any accrediting agency tells you. Universities are about creating and disseminating knowledge, but they and their accreditation agencies try mightily to keep the public from knowing much about the knowledge gained in college. Students spend far less time today, about 1/3 less time today, studying on average than they did 50 years ago when Andrew went to school, or actually earlier than when Andrew went to school. Andrew's sort of in the transition period. And because of that, they learn less. Grade inflation is a big part of the reason. Ban it. No government money should go to schools where the average campus grade exceeds a B, where everyone gets A's. 9th and most important, the federal government should get out of the student loan business. High school graduates wanting to open an auto body shop have to go to a bank to finance that goal. Why shouldn't those wanting to go to college do the same? If we persist in federal lending, minimally make colleges have some skin in the game, making them partially financially responsible when their students default on their loans. I should briefly comment on some other problems. I want to keep this short, so I won't go too long. The pandemic led to dramatic increases, of course, in the use of computerized instruction. The evidence, I think, is pretty clear from the K through 12 level that this led to significant learning decline. And my sense is that the same thing is true with college. The promise of capital labor substitution, so vital to productivity advance in the private industry, seems more limited in higher ed. Much of student learning comes directly or indirectly from human interaction, students talking directly to faculty mentors. And of course, the jury is still very much out on the impact of artificial intelligence. I've said nothing about graduate or professional education, or about other forms of post-secondary learning, such as community colleges, coding academies, or other forms of vocationally enhancing instruction. They demonstrate that traditional academic degrees are not always the optimal preparation for adult life. Many lawyers tell me that they learn the basis of law schools in 2 years. Why then do we have 3-year law schools? Why does it often take 6 to 8 years to get a PhD in the humanities, only then to get a job as a barista at Starbucks? Do we need as many years of instruction to turn out physicians as we currently do? Perhaps, I don't know, but I'm somewhat skeptical. Why don't medical schools stick to teaching and research and get out of running hospitals? Ohio State raised $500 million for its endowment, making long-term lease arrangements with private firms to operate parking lots associated with their hospitals and clinic operations, saying that we're in the education business, not the parking lot business. Shouldn't more of this be happening? Intercollegiate athletics is in dramatic transition. It has virtually nothing to do with higher education. Why don't universities sell or lease their stadiums, basketball arenas, and associated parking lots that have nothing to do with education? Developing strategic alliances with privately owned sporting operations akin to the minor leagues in baseball. Why don't professors sell their services to multiple universities? And for that matter, why don't students study at multiple schools? Why not let some degree aggregators assess student achievement and award degrees, also using that previously mentioned National College Equivalent exam? Why do we encourage some educational monopolist, one university, typically to handle all the post-secondary educational needs of students? I've said nothing about governing boards. They're often honorific appendages with little important role other than occasionally selecting new university presidents. One university trustee told me recently that, quote, "We are a bunch of potted plants," end of quote. Well, interfering in daily operations is inappropriate. More aggressive trustee leadership in setting broad policies often could reduce the horrible problems arising from university communities losing sight of their appropriate role in modern society, diluting the ideological excesses, promoting institutional neutrality on public policy issues, and putting limits on administrative bloat, just to mention a few issues. I used to say that with the possible exception of prostitution, teaching is the only profession having had absolutely no productivity advance in the 2,400 years since Socrates taught the youth of Athens. Higher education is overly inefficient, overly ideological, sometimes overly attentive to its mission of discovering and disseminating knowledge and new ideas. Abraham Lincoln arguably gave the greatest speech ever given in the English language, the Gettysburg Address, using only 271 words. But I've already used 8 times as many, nearly 2,300. It's time to stop. Thank you.
I always suspected you were less efficient than Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for providing that overview. For those people who have not read Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the term creative destruction, it sounds bad, like destruction bad. So can you just give us a brief overview, not necessarily higher ed related, of why creative destruction is good?
Well, creative destruction means people have to be on their toes. It means that if they make a mistake, they pay big prices. So J.C. Penney is not what it used to be. Sears and Roebuck, does it still exist? Hardly. It's not what it used to be. They somehow misjudged markets. They misjudged people's tastes. They misjudged technology. Maybe they misjudged prices of resources. For one reason or other, they made mistakes. And the price of making mistakes is high. So so businesses have to be very, very alert and are hypersensitive to mistakes and failure. Universities are much less so. They make a mistake. Professors have tenure. What difference does it make? You know, maybe their raise will be a few dollars smaller the next time around. They may pay a minor price for this, but nothing very serious. Administrators keep doing what they do. There's no consequences. But if we start seeing universities dropping like flies, and we're starting to see more of that, we are seeing, instead of 10 schools or 15 schools die out each year that you might have heard of, now we're seeing dozens. My friend Mr. Goodman in the audience here is more an expert on this than I am. But it's picking up. The numbers are growing. And as that happens, colleges are getting more and more scared. What can we do to stop this? What can we do differently? I think that's a healthy trend.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say is keeping, what are the top like one or two things that are keeping in higher education specifically from seeing the creative discretion that we see in, say, the Fortune 500 firms?
Well, we're at the Cato Institute, a very appropriate place to talk about this, because government is there. It makes it hard to make. They're there. We'll save you. We'll protect you. We'll keep you. And so I think the ultimate question is, who owns the universities? It's an ownership issue. Who owns the universities? Are they owned by, legally, usually by a board of trustees or something? But the faculty, at least at the school that I teach at, kind of think they have a big role in owning the university. They have a faculty senate who makes proclamations and all sorts of things. The alumni sometimes think they own the universities, and they have some justification. Take Johns Hopkins up the road. Would they ever do anything important that Mr. Bloomberg disliked? No. Why? Mr. Bloomberg's given $2 or $3 billion to them. Same thing at Oregon State. What's the Nike guy? Phil Knight. Phil Knight's given over $1 trillion, $2 billion, adding a few zeros, inflation, you know. A couple $1 billion to Oregon. So these guys have a lot of power. So there's a big sort of fight for control at universities, kind of implicit. It's behind the scenes. We don't read about it a lot in the newspaper. There's no stock, proxy fights in higher ed. But underneath things, there is a lot of that. And because, Elon Musk, you might love him or you might hate him, but he runs Tesla. I don't think anyone, or SpaceX. I don't think anyone doubts that he runs them. And, but who runs Georgetown University? Who George Washington University? University of Maryland? Who runs them? Well, they have a president, but does that president really run the place? What is his role? Very ambiguous often.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great things about reading Rich's books are that he raises questions that nobody else raises. And one of these concerns university subsidization. So if you read throughout higher education, there's just the assumption that universities need to be subsidized. And you, in a couple of places, actually raise the issue of maybe taxing universities. Yeah,
that's big. Let me tell a little quick story about Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote a book called, what was it, Capitalism and Freedom, 1962, I think. He wrote this book, and in it he said, basically, I believe in markets. I believe governments should relinquish control over many activities. He showed a lot of faith in markets. But he did say, well, education's a little different, and higher education's a little different, because there's all these, what economists now call positive externalities, positive spillover effects of colleges. So maybe we should subsidize universities still. He said this in 1962. Well, in 2003, I got a little ornery, and I wrote Milton, who I knew a little bit, and I said, Professor Friedman, 40 years ago, you said government should subsidize universities. The government's belong in the higher ed business. What do you think now? He says, well, there are some positive spillover effects of colleges. If one student learns with a college education learns some, the workers around that person with only a high school diploma may gain from the knowledge of the college grad. I think there's some truth to that, by the way. There are some spillover effects. But he said also there are negative externalities to higher ed. This is writing before all of the campus protests of the last few years. He said, it would be an interesting empirical study whether we should be taxing universities or subsidizing them. In other words, he held out the possibility that maybe we should not only stop subsidizing them, maybe they should even be taxed. So I think if Milton Friedman were alive today, the Cato Institute's a good place to talk about Friedman. I have a feeling Friedman would have an altogether different view about higher ed than he did in 1962. He had, that is, we could go on and talk about the endowment taxes and all of that stuff, but that's probably getting a little too far afield.
So did these negative externalities, did they exist in 1962, or are they new? And if they're new, what brought them up?
You know, I have been teaching, as I said, I was literally teaching school the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That was a long time ago, 1963, November 22nd. I was literally, I was a grad student teaching at the University of Illinois, and I was teaching then. And by the way, that was quite an experience, teaching after a presidential assassination, one of the more challenging teaching moments of my life, early in my life. So things have changed a lot over time. I mentioned one change. This is maybe going afield. It is true, when I started teaching at a mid-quality state university, kids studied 40 hours a week. They were in class, writing papers, or reading assignments, going to the library, whatever, 40 hours a week on average. Some 50, 60, others 20 or 30, a lot of variation around those averages. But that's what time use data done by the federal government show. What do they show today? 27 hours a week. 27 hours a week. 27 hours a week for how many weeks a year? 32. 32. Now, I studied mathematics back when they taught it the right way, and 32 times 27 is 894. 894 hours a year. Kids are in school today. Their parents are working about twice as many hours, making money to send them to school. Why the hell can't the kids go to school more? Why can't they work a little harder? Why can't we give them C's anymore? We might, hurt their self-esteem may be hurt. Well, the hell with their self-esteem. What's important is learning. What's important is advancing. What's important is the transition from adolescence to adulthood. And that includes more than the pure academic part of it. There's other parts of that dimension. But that's what we should be concentrating on, and I think we're losing sight of that.
So as Rich mentioned, he was actually a professor of mine 20-some years ago, and I can tell you for sure that he did not care about my self-esteem back then either.
No, and I don't now either.
Yeah.
I do care about his self-esteem now.
So there's a great quote from Gordon Winston that I think I think helps kind of frame a lot of the conversations that are going around higher ed. So this is Gordon Winston writing that universities are essentially part church and part car dealer, devoted partly to charity and partly to commerce. The result is a tension between doing good and doing well. Can you explain what he meant by that and what the implications for us are as we think about higher education and especially public policy?
Well, car dealers have to sell something. They have to be good at selling a product. University presidents have to be good at selling a product. Steve, you know that more than anyone. Mr. Goodman is in that business, so to speak. So that's the car dealer part. You got to be able to sell a product. But you're also trying to do something a little bit more noble, more like what a religion would do. You're trying to turn out people who are better in some sense, who have more virtue than they did before, and also have more learning than before. To have virtue, you have to have some learning. And so I think Winston kind of got at that kind of in a cute way, and it's very much true. Good university presidents, by the way, are gems. They should be. I don't know what to say. I've gotten to know 2 or 3 in my life that I really respect. I'll even mention some names. Mitch Daniels, who was president at Purdue University, ran that school for a decade without raising tuition $1. It stayed the same for 10 years. The price inflation was 25%. Andrew and I, we have some interesting stories. We can talk about price inflation in education, but that's a story for another day. But inflation was going on in the economy as a whole. It was going on in universities even more, but not at Purdue. Did Purdue's reputation fall in that period? No, it went up in the U.S. News rankings. Did his endowment fall? No, it soared. People said, Purdue's a cool place. He did something right. And he also was a governor of the state of Indiana beforehand. So he knew the political process. He was the head of OMB, wasn't he? Here, he was a part of the Washington scene. He ran the budget office for the federal government. So he knew a lot about finance. He worked at Eli Lilly and Company for years. So he had a nice combination of private sector work, government experience, understood politicians, but was basically a businessman, and is. And I must say he's a good friend of mine, so I pick on him a lot. And there are other presidents like that. We ought to be cloning them. One is retiring in another month, 300 miles from here, who's been an incredible individual. His name's Gordon Gee. He's been the president of 5 major universities, 2 in the Brown University, Vanderbilt, 2 prestigious private universities, but also Ohio State, the University of Colorado, and West Virginia U. And 50 years, he's been a president for over 40 years. And we ought to be cloning those people. We ought to be looking at them. What makes them work? And I plan to be doing some consulting work with those guys in the future, by the way. So
one of the topics that's been getting a lot of attention here in DC is closing the Department of Education, which when I read your book, it seemed like you were mostly on board, but you also did appreciate some of the data that the department produces.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we want to sort of attack the data. The data are, that's like supporting ignorance or something. The data are important. You can't evaluate something unless you know what's going on. And we have some good data that comes out of the Department of Education. Maybe it ought to come out of another agency. I could concede that as a possibility. So I'm a little bit concerned about some of the recent attacks on the data. I worked with 3 or 4 secretaries of education. I was on something called the Spellings Commission. on the future of higher ed, appointed by, ostensibly by the Secretary of Education, but my appointment came from the White House, I'm told. This was in 2006, and we were going to really reform education. We came in with some great ideas, none of which were adopted by anyone. But in doing that, I learned a lot about the Department of Education. Let me tell you just one little snippet of a story about the Department of Education. It bugs the heck out of me. Students, in order to get student financial aid, have to fill out something called the FAFSA form. What is it? Free application
For federal student aid.
Federal application for free, whatever. Anyway, it's a form that you have to fill out, government form, and to determine how much aid you should get from your university, private or public. In 2007, I attended a meeting with the Secretary of Education and leaders in the higher education community. A very well-respected professor at the University of Michigan, for example, Sue Donarski, several others like this. And the form that kids had to fill out to get student aid, to fill out this thing, was about 120, 130 questions long. And we told the Secretary of Education, there was debate in our group whether that number should be reduced to 0 or to 30. No one thought we needed more than 30 questions. That was in 2006 and 7. She says, we're going to do it. So in 2019, the questionnaire is still 120 questions long. They didn't do a damn thing. So the U.S. Congress, the gang of 535 over here, passed legislation that was enacted into law that directed the Department of Education to shape up and come up with a simplified FAFSA form. By 2022, 23, something like that, they still hadn't gotten it done. And when it finally came, when they did come out, they botched the operation badly. We had a chaos for a year with student admissions because kids couldn't fill out the FAFSA form. It was horrible. There is a lot of inertia and inefficiency in that agency. So that side of me says, let's abolish it. I even wrote a piece once that recommended that we have the Air Force on Saturday and Sunday strategically bomb the location on Maryland Avenue, appropriately letting people leave the building before we did it, knock the building down, and then the space is so close to the Smithsonian, just turn it over to the Smithsonian for an expansion of the Air and Space Museum. Public would love it, learning would increase, and we'd get rid of an agency we didn't need. So I've been pretty much in favor of doing this, and you know, I knew Betsy DeVos, and I know I was best buds with Bill Bennett, and I've known a lot of the secretaries of ed over the years, and deputy secretaries, people like Ted Mitchell, who's now running American Council of Education. I got to know all these people, most of them pretty good people, but it is one of the glories of America in higher ed is we are 2,000-3,000 different schools. We all have every school has a little different philosophy, a little different curriculum, a little different approach. In America, you can go to thousands of different, you have options, thousands. In Britain or France or Germany, there's one monolithic Ministry of Education that sort of has the same curriculum pretty much across the country. There's less choice. So the department, so we need that choice. And one thing, when you centralize things, in Washington, you're tending to reduce that choice. we don't have, these people we ought to let them talk.
I've got a couple more questions for you, but we'll let them talk.
You're awfully uppity for a former student of mine, I
Well, it's
must
because
say.
nobody reinforced my self-esteem when I was a student.
No.
Okay, so I will cut
Andrew
down
was
my
a good
questions.
student, by the way, I must say.
So shorter questions, or well, actually the questions are the same length, but shorter answers, so we can get the audience involved here. So New College of Florida. So in a couple of places in the book, you seem very skeptical of the approach that's being taken down there, which I always like when somebody who agrees with the sort of anti-woke impetus disagrees with the way it's being done. So can you explain a little bit more about what you're worried?
It was a typical woke, far leftish oriented liberal arts college. It's part of a university, but masquerading as a liberal arts college, 700-800 students roughly, when Andrew, something like that. And I visited down there once. Ron DeSantis came in, appointed an all-new board of trustees for the place, who came in and said, we're going to rip this this college apart. We're going to change its very nature. And they did that pretty much. And it was awfully disruptive. I thought there was room for a flaky left-wing college in Florida. There ought to be some flaky right-wing colleges in Florida, too. There ought to be some flaky colleges that are flaky because they believe in academic excellence and kids who are nerds who study all the time. There ought to be those kind of colleges. There ought to be all kinds of different colleges. And New College was different. So and one of the new trustees, who was a very distinguished English professor at Emory University, who now lives in D.C., Mark Bauerlein, he also worked for the government for a while, published some stuff that I did, and Mark went on their board, and I haven't talked to him, I think he thinks maybe they gone a little too far, because there's some saying, we got to rip this out, we got to radically change it. Well, another thing along those same lines, it's kind of interesting, one way to deal with, you think there's too much left-wing orientation, not enough diversity of opinion, you can start new think tanks or centers at these schools that are more traditional in their orientation, both politically and educationally, and that's happened in Florida, for example. Andrew went to Florida State. It's happened in my state of Ohio. It's happening in quite a number of states. They're setting up these, some people call them conservative centers. I don't know if the word conservative is appropriate, more traditionally oriented schools. I think that's a healthy trend. I think there's a little bit too much slash and burn at New College, I thought. But
yeah. So we are going to open this up to the audience. So we're going to be taking questions from both online and in person. So if you're online watching the stream, you can join the conversation and submit questions directly on the event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and on X. When you are asking a question, we're going to have folks coming around with microphones. Please state your name, affiliation if you want to. You can give a short context, but keep the context short and do try to get to the question. And as we're getting set up with that, I will ask you one last question about these competitive credit aggregators. So I think this is one of the coolest ideas in the book.
Yeah, I like it too.
So can you explain what it was and what it was?
Well, you know, why can't a kid go to, I'll use the local area here in D.C. as an example, why can't a kid take 24 credit hours at Georgetown University, 24 at the University of Maryland at College Park, 16 hours at a community college, teaching some basic stuff, maybe languages or something, and 1 year go to Europe and maybe do a study abroad program and do 24 or 30 hours there. So you end up with 130, 40 hours of credit. Well, who gives you the degree? Well, yet the schools will say, well, you'd only studied with us for 24 hours or 28. That's not right. So we have a degree aggregator, someone who says, who's respected, well versed in the academic world and in believing in quality, and we say, does this kid have enough hours to deserve a bachelor's degree? Then you can throw on my little super post-AC test, T-test, my National College Equivalency Exam too, as part of the project. And if the kid does okay, we say, you have a bachelor's degree. Why not?
Sounds great. Okay, so let's open it up to the audience. So we'll start on this side. So just pick whoever you see, arm. Yeah.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much for this book, by the way, and thank you for taking a stand like this. I'm Andrew Sachs, Noble Learning, where youth trade live learning and leadership instead of likes. With all the changes that are happening with AI, the technology shifting, should we even be looking at having universities teach skills and real problem solving rather than knowledge transfer? Is that another layer on top of the change that needs to happen?
Well, I'm not I'm thinking about your question. It's a profound one. The minute you mention artificial intelligence, it got me thinking. As an economic historian, societies advance mainly by replacing physical labor with machines, and that raised productivity, raised incomes, a greater affluence. This is a unique kind of development where machines are replacing thought, the mind. They're replacing professors, perhaps. And do we really need professors anymore? Do we need is this learning sufficiently revolutionary that we ought to rethink the way we, quote, educate people? And as I said in my remarks, in my one sentence statement, I said, the jury is still out on this. I'm not sure. I just don't know. I do think that machines can do things that very smart people do less well, and that's going to become more prevalent rather than less prevalent with the passage of time. And therefore, maybe the concept of a university is questionable. Yeah. Do we really need universities? I don't know the answer to that. I've been teaching back, since the dark ages. When I started teaching, we didn't have television in class. We didn't have, had nothing. No internet, nothing. Yet, you want to know something? I think that students that studied 40, 60, this maybe sounds like an old man reminiscing about his past, and it probably is that. But I think there's some empirical evidence supporting the idea that the students who went to college in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, by most criteria, are at least as good and as prepared for the adult living and as smart and as knowledgeable as the students on average are today, for all of the reasons, including grade inflation, all of this stuff. And I think artificial intelligence offers a new challenge, and I don't know the answer. Some of you are smarter than me, maybe you have the answer.
Do we have any questions on this side? Oh, we got one up front here.
There's a student there with a question.
Yes, good afternoon. I have a question. First of all, I'm very proud to have attended University of Maryland College Park, and I found out it was one of the best schools, and it's a state school, but it's just a beautiful campus, and they have incredible curriculum. If you've been there before, I hope. So my question to you is, who right now would you say you admire most of the big players? Google partially started there, being that Sergey Brin attended there before he went to
Who are
Stanford.
the big players in higher education?
Yes, and also who've evolved into
Yeah.
leadership roles
I
in
can't
tech.
speak specifically to the University of Maryland, although it's kind of amusing that you asked that, because my university, several people who have been prominent at my university have gone on to the University of Maryland, or the other way around, had a very fine relationship with them. You know, there are winners and losers in higher ed. Even with all these subsidies and everything, there are some schools that are better than others. And I think we ought to do a better job of identifying who those are. Andrew, did you work with, for a while, this is a confession I'm going to make. I ranked colleges and universities for Forbes magazine. I started their rankings. I'm the father of them. I even once went, it's hard to believe this, to Kazakhstan in the middle of nowhere, to a conference with a bunch of Chinese on how do we rank colleges. The Chinese said, the only thing that's important is research. Teaching doesn't matter. We don't care what the kids learn. The only thing important is, and then, you know, others would say, oh, that's all wrong. And all. It's kind of amusing. And that's part of the problem is, how do you define what our product is? How do you measure success? How do you measure excellence? It's a big issue. Is research so important that we should, you know, look at the Harvards of the world as really research institutions that happen to teach some undergraduate students, is like, you know, like public schools teach kindergarten, you know, give them a little beginning, a little taste of what life is before school. Or is it something more than that? Can a Harvard be, or a University of Maryland, a better example, University of Maryland, can it be all things to all people? And it can. University of Maryland opened a second campus up in Baltimore County, UMBC. Marvelous school. I've spoken there. I think it's great. And so out of the original University of Maryland came some in advancement, I guess you would say, innovation, new ideas. They brought in a dynamic gentleman who ran that school for years, and they became an R1 institution, a high research-oriented institution. And I admire schools like, we ought to study people like that. The guys that run that, I forgot his name, but he was great. We should study them more. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's take a question from online here. So apparently Clayton Christensen once said, employers want people who have the skills to do the job. Universities don't understand that that is their job. How do we fix that?
I like Clay Christensen, the late Clay Christensen. He passed away a few years ago. Repeat that. I didn't quite get it.
So employers want people who have the skills to do the job.
Okay.
And I'm going to mangle the quote here, but it's a quote from the internet, so it's probably already mangled. Universities don't understand that it's their job to prepare the students for.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. I'm a college professor. What do I know about the real world? I mean, really. I do a crummy job of teaching for years. What happens to me? I get a slightly smaller raise than my colleague next door. He gets a $1,000 raise. I get an $800 raise. Big whoop. That's what I was talking about, creative destruction. In business, my gosh, that makes a difference. Oh. And I think just magnifies the point I was making earlier. I wish Clay Christensen were still alive. What he would think of Joseph Schumpeter's taking his idea, which, by the way, comes from a book he wrote in 1942. You know, I'd be interested in knowing what he says. I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions here.
Hi, my name is Killian Mallon. I was a former postdoc and lecturer at Stanford. It's often said on Stanford that it's California's largest real estate company with a small educational nonprofit attached. And so my question is, how do you stop the proliferation of sort of profit-seeking behavior by universities? They seem to be growing just more and more towards real estate.
Proliferation of what?
Of sort of real estate profit goal as opposed to education.
Yeah, as one who spent one summer at Stanford or nearby, I was living in Menlo Park or somewhere, I don't know, nearby. I would walk across the Stanford campus every day, and it was a challenge to get across the campus. I mean, it was 8,000 acres or something? There are schools with enormous resources, and Stanford's one. The Texas schools are another set, because they have by law an ownership interest in most of the oil in the state of Texas. The endowment of the University of Texas is greater than that at Stanford, and Stanford has a heck of a large endowment. And I think when you gather these huge, massive amounts of resources, how does that distort the way you operate? And does it just provide a cushion that allows for more inefficiency? Are you really, you don't have to worry. You made a mistake. You bungled something. Well, we have an endowment of $40, $50 billion. So what? We'll survive. Harvard, and actually Princeton's a little bit better example than Harvard, because on a per student basis, I think they have a little higher endowment. Some of these schools have an endowment of $3 or $4 million per student. $4 million per student, if invested, if you pay out 5%, which is what private foundations are required to pay out by the federal government to avoid paying taxes. 5% of $40 billion is a heck of a lot of money. It's $2 billion. And that means Harvard University or Princeton and Yale, they all get a couple $1 billion every year, a couple $1 million every year for every student. My university operates on $30,000, $35,000 a year per student. That's what it costs. The University of Maryland, probably a little higher, probably 50. The best public universities, Virginia, Michigan, Berkeley, a little more, 75,000, 100,000. Why should Harvard have 2 or 3 times that? I mean, so therein lies a current public policy issue. What should we do about these massive endowments? J.D. Vance, who used to be my senator and now is vice president, says tax the hell out of them. He won, and the Congress is leaning in that way, I understand. Some of them are, with rates up to 21%, for example. Meaning if you made $1 billion in income off your investments, 21% of that, $210 million, would have to be turned over to the federal government. Is that the appropriate solution? I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, we have too much endowment, the disparities in endowment are huge, and perhaps we have something needs to be done. But on the other hand, if someone wants to give their money to Harvard University, why shouldn't they be able to, and why should it be differentially taxed relative to giving money to something else? I don't know. I think there's arguments both ways. There's a young man there who's had his hand up about 40 times. I'm trying to get you called on, my friend, whoever you are. He looks like he might be an actual college student.
Yes, I am, sadly. So,
Cool.
my name is Diego Berisbeitia. I'm an intern here at Cato, actually. My question is, how do you feel about this new initiative we've been seeing, like the University of Austin, which brands itself as like anti-woke, or other types of initiatives like I think the name was Peterson Academy by Jordan Peterson, which claims to be better than a college at like 1% of the cost?
Well, first of all, I have visited the University of Austin. I have been there. I've seen them in operation a little bit, not much. I think it's a very interesting experiment. You know how many students go to the University of Austin? How many the first year? 86. How many are going to be there next year? Maybe 200. So it's a little early to do much of an assessment on a school that's barely in existence. It has a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of very bright people. Neil Ferguson and her wife, Ian Hershey Ali come to mind. Roland Fryer, brilliant economist at Harvard. A lot of interesting people who are doing a little bit of teaching there. Is it shaking the world up? It's too early to say. I think it's a lot of resources going into a interesting experiment, but I don't see it revolutionizing higher ed at this point. That may be an inappropriate assessment. So I don't know. There's several of these new schools starting up. Someone mentioned Jordan Peterson. He's been involved with one or two. There's an interesting one starting in North Carolina, which is a 3-year degree. You know, you spend, 7.5, 8 months a year in an academic year, in a year studying, going to school, 2 semesters a year. You do that for 4 years, so you study 30 months. Yet it takes 4 years to get a degree, 45 months to get a degree, but you're actually only in doing stuff 30 months. So that's why Oxford says, hey, they can do it in 3 years. So I think some of these ideas, that's not your question, but I think new innovations like this, where we try to do something a little different, need to be explored. So I'm for them. I like the University of Austin. It's a crazy place, but I like it. I mean, it's crazy. And they spend a ridiculous amount of money for a very few students. I don't think it's an economically viable model. And their problem will be ultimately an accreditation. The accrediting agencies say, well, we don't like what you're doing. Who makes up the accrediting agencies? The Southern accrediting agencies, the general ones, used to be called SACS, has a broader name now. One time I looked up their their governing board. There's 72 people on their governing board, which is too large for a governing board. Almost all of them were professors or deans at universities, not the general public. They're going to say, you got to do what we're doing, or you can't go into business. We're not going to let you start. That's ridiculous.
So I think we've got another question way in the back there.
Thank you. This is a very interesting conversation. My name is Sanjeev Berry. I wanted to ask Professor a follow-up question on your argument that state governments should consider who they give the funding to when it comes to state universities. And if I heard you right, potentially providing the funding to the customers, the students.
Yeah.
So the tension that I see, and when I think back to the decisions that I made going into college, are that a lot of students or young people who are about to become students don't have a clear sense of the labor market. They don't know the skills they're going to need, and you're making big decisions at age 18, age 19, age 17.
Okay.
So how do you address that?
You got to do something with your life at 18. What is it? You're making decisions as a fairly immature, only moderately mature person. Most people, rely partly on their parents, partly on U.S. News and World Report, partly on relatives and friends. There's no, to me, optimal path that is always works for everyone. I'm from a very poor area of the country, Appalachia, Ohio. It's the poor part of Ohio, and I don't want to overstate our poverty. We have indoor plumbing, and we most of the time have electricity. It goes off once in a while. We have flooding and we have some little problems that they don't have in D.C. much. The Potomac doesn't flood very often, does it? I don't think so. Anyway, yeah, we face these problems, and 25% of the kids should probably be going to college and getting degrees. 25% of the kids probably should be going to some vocational school and learning some skills of some sort. The other 50% is sort of in between. Some of them should be going to community college, should go to coding academies. I don't have a magic bullet to help make that decision. I really don't. I don't know the answer to that. And I'm sorry, was it cheap getting in here today? I hope you didn't pay too much to come here. So I can't, guarantee, if you're unhappy, take your business elsewhere.
I would encourage you not to do that.
Yeah.
Well, that leads into this next question, which is, if we got rid of student loans, federal student loans, and banks were doing the lending, wouldn't that mean a lot less people would go to college? And if so, is that a good thing?
Well, I think probably too many kids go to college. I think the optimal number, going to four-year schools is probably a little less than it is. But you raise the banks and so forth. There's all kinds of ways we could finance colleges. Why don't we have income share agreements? What an income share agreement is, you want to go to college, you want to go to University of Maryland at College Park, you think it's going to cost you $150,000 to go there for 4 years, whatever. You think you can probably finance half of that with what your family can put up and what you can otherwise gather. Why don't you go to not a lender, but to an investor and say, I will sell you stock in me. In me. You want to buy part of me? You want to buy 12% of my earnings after college graduation for the next 15 years. Give me $100,000 to go to college, and I'll give you 15% of my income for the next X number of years. The terms would vary. And the kids wanting to major in computer science, who are going to Princeton or Columbia or local University of Maryland, George Mason, could probably get $60,000 that way, $80,000 that way. The kid wanting to major in gender studies, going to the University of Last Resort, whatever that is, might have a hard time borrowing, because investors would be buying a share of the people. Why don't we do that? That's what indentured servitude was, which everyone disliked, and I thought was a great invention. In the 17th, 18th century, everyone coming to America was poor. There are very few rich people coming to America. It cost about a year's income just to pay for the passage across the Atlantic, and it was dangerous. So what did they do? People said, you come to America, well, I'll pay your passage, and I'll get you a job, and we'll give you enough to keep alive. But you have to work for us for 7 years, or 5 years, whatever. So people gave up some income that they would otherwise earn in America to pay for their passage to America. Why don't we do the same thing with colleges now?
He believes so much in indentured servitude that when I was his research assistant, he tried to recreate the system. Okay, we have time for one more question, and it's about tenure.
Oh.
And so you can go into broadly pro or con at this point in history.
Well, tenure does serve a useful function, but it's an expensive function. It's a costly function. It's not that it's bad, but there are a lot of people, tenure is a fixed cost. When someone is given tenure, even as a history professor, English professor at age 35, that person is gaining a $2 million, $3 million stream of income for the rest of their life. Universities are making a $2 million commitment on a person. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, depends, on the salary, etc., age, what have you. It's a big commitment. So that's awfully expensive. And so it's an awfully costly way of providing some sort of security. However, tenure probably lowers wages from what they otherwise would be because, hey, I got a great fringe benefit. I got job security. So people with tenure may make, say, $80,000 a year, who without tenure would demand $90,000 or a little more to get. So it has its costs and it has its benefits. I must say, the governor of the state of Ohio, this is a real quick story. The governor of the state of Ohio, I was an ornery tenured professor, really obnoxious. I would complain when the governor did something crazy or something. So the governor of Ohio called a press conference and he said, I give Richard Vedder an F on his report card. The governor of Ohio did that. And everyone said, aren't you scared? I said, I rejoiced. I said, I'm being finally recognized by someone other than the whole world now knows me. The governor of Ohio hates me. That's great. But I said what I said, and it was about taxes in Ohio, and I spoke up, and he was madder than hell at me. He called the president of my university. He said, you've got to fire Vedder. And he said, Vedder has tenure. He said, I don't care. You got to fire him. He says, I can't. He has tenure. It's an obligation. It's in our faculty handbook or whatever the hell it's in. And you can't fire him. I can't fire him. Sorry, Governor. The governor, by the way, went on to become a university president afterwards. Another interesting little story. And I got away with murder. Well, not murder. I got away with it. And so tenure came out. It was very handy for me, I must say. It was very handy for me. But I wasn't the ordinary, typical faculty member. We've taken up an awful lot of their time.
So we are out of time, so we're gonna have to end here. Again, the book is Let Colleges Fail. We have copies of it out here. We also have a reception for those of you who are in attendance physically. Please join us in Winter Garden, and thank you all for coming to the Cato Institute for this excellent book forum.